Good evening to all of you, and good morning to you, Ashish, and others who are joining in from outside India. I'm Pankaj Chandra. I'm at Ahmedabad University, and welcome to this conference on the changing nature of innovation. This pandemic and the ensuing slowdown of economic activity globally appear to have had two very interesting consequences. One is perhaps a dramatic shift towards sectoral engagement with life sciences, health, medical engineering, digital and telehealth, and of course the structure of public health, its delivery, as well as an urgency in the exploration of real consequences of the impact of climate change on health, sustainability, and livelihood. The second is a strong conversation to decentralize manufacturing globally. And what we've been hearing since the second wave in India is the risk that the world appears to be perceiving on vaccine production out of it. So global politics will drive hard how firms and countries will negotiate technological innovations and its reach to the market. The big question, however, before us in India is, what is this market? The need to coordinate national policy with regional and firm level policies is on the critical path now. And if India is to bring the benefit of innovation to lift the quality of living of all its people, then I think this is at a stage where we need to address it very, very urgently. The benefits of innovation have stayed largely with those with factor endowments, thereby reducing access to benefits of innovation to the majority of population, as well as increasing inequality. This conference is a conversation to build vibrant mechanisms around our understanding of the new dynamics of innovation and ways to make it integral to the Indian economy and its growth, and of course to the global economy, which has experienced it much stronger as well. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you and our speakers and commentators over the next 4 evenings. And it's an invitation to invite you to engage with issues around how innovation is evolving and changing in these times. We have a very serious congregation of speakers who've been working on issues of innovation for long. Janak Nabar will introduce them in more detail when he talks about the structure of the conference. But let me welcome, on behalf of Rakesh, Naushad, Janak, and our conference team, our speakers at this conference: Ashish, Nick, Chirantan, Mehkal, Santosh, Abhishek, Ambuj, and Nandita. I hope all of you will engage with the ideas of our speakers. They bring many years of research experience on various aspects of technology, strategy, and policy in different domains. This conference has been put together by Ahmedabad University and the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research, or STIER. Ahmedabad University is a young research university that has been set up within the traditions of the subcontinental inquiry and global mindset. It positions itself as an interdisciplinary academic environment that purports to bring liberal arts and the professions to work with each other in addressing complex questions of the society. STIER is a research center based out of Pune that puts technology development and its impact on economic and social growth at the center of its inquiry. Its work aims to influence policy as well as practices within organizations towards building of a robust national innovation system. So welcome to the day one of this 4-day conference. Thank you. And over to you, Naushad.
Thank you, Pankaj, and good evening and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to join Pankaj in welcoming you all to this conference and to these next four days that we will be together. Pankaj has already introduced Ahmedabad University and very kindly also STIER. He's been very much part of our mentoring group that has helped us establish STIER over these years. One of the key objectives of STIER is to bring together people working in this field in the country. And this conference, I think, addresses that really wonderfully. We're particularly delighted to be partnering in STIER with Ahmedabad University in this conference. And in particular with you, Pankaj. The first time that Pankaj and I spent any time together was actually when he asked me to visit him in Ahmedabad at IIM and give a talk on India's national innovation system. And that must be almost 20 years ago, I think.
20+ years ago.
So a long time back. And Ahmedabad University is, I think, one of our great emerging institutions in higher education. It's one of our most interesting and thoughtful institutions in the country. I'd really like to compliment both Ahmedabad University and STIER on putting together a great program around 4 really excellent themes. Janak will talk about those in a few minutes. But let me just pick up some of them as I was reading some of the papers, especially the 2 papers for today. The relationship between, Pankaj talked about some of the new questions that we need to address in innovation studies. But there are some old questions that we constantly need to revisit. What is the relationship between technology and science, which Ashish's paper talks about and addresses so nicely, between development and research? What is the role of general purpose technologies or platform technologies in the wider innovation space? What is the role of the state in all of this, in building a vibrant innovation ecosystem? And what role do firms play? And how does the role of firms address both the innovation needs of a society and get fostered by this wider understanding of how innovation happens? All of these were great areas of inquiry 30 years back, and I think they remain great questions to keep coming back to today because the relationship between them is constantly evolving. A last comment about today, and it's a particular pleasure, I think, to see today's session. And that's entirely because of the 2 speakers. Nick Bloom is an old friend, and his work on anything, I think, is rich in data. It provides you with a broad perspective, and it's full of insight, as we see in today's paper too. And greatly look forward to hearing from him a little later in the evening. And a particular pleasure to be sharing this screen with Ashish Arora. Ashish and I overlapped some at Stanford many, many years ago. We were both skinny then and had more hair then. And we had a common mentor in Nate Rosenberg. Nate was Ashish's PhD advisor. And I took courses from him as well. I think I know I benefited massively from his many writings in the field over the years. I really enjoyed both papers, and I really look forward to hearing the presentations this evening and to the discussion that will then follow. But I just join Pankaj in wishing you all a really interesting discussion over these next 4 days. These are wonderful topics for us to be engaging with. Thank you. Over to you, Janak.
Thank you, Naushad. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Janak Nabar. I head the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Economic Research. Really excited to have all of you here today. Just wanted to give a quick tour of the session. So Naushad has already mentioned we kickstart with the macro perspective session with Nick Bloom and Ashish Arora. The session will be chaired by Rakesh Basant. Tomorrow, day 2, sees a session on healthcare, which will be chaired by Naushad. And the speakers are Mikhail Tombak from the University of Toronto and Chirantan Chatterjee from IIM Ahmedabad. On Friday, the 28th, we have a session on energy and environment. The session chair will be Ambud Sagar from the School of Public Policy at IIT Delhi. And the speakers include Santosh Sahu from IIT Madras and Abhishek Malhotra from IIT Delhi. And we conclude the conference with a session on manufacturing, chaired by Pankaj Chandra, and the speakers include Nandita Matthew and myself. So we're really excited to be organizing this jointly with Ahmedabad University and have such eminent people, with us through all these 4 days. And I do hope that many of you will join the discussion and continue to stay friends beyond this conference. Before I hand it over to Rakesh Basant, I just a quick note of introduction. Professor Rakesh Basant, he's a professor of economics and the JSW Professor of Innovation and Public Policy at IIM Ahmedabad, and he is the session chair for today. So again, a big welcome to you all, and I now hand it over to Professor Basant. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Janak, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conference and part of the inaugural session as well. Without taking more time, I would briefly introduce Ashish and then ask him to take over. Professor Ashish Arora is a Senior Associate Dean for Strategy and Rex T. Adams Professor of Business Administration at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. His research focuses on economics of technology and technical change. His work has focused most on technology-intensive industries such as software, biotechnology, and chemicals, the economics of information security, and the role of patents and licensing in promoting technology startups. His current research focuses on the management of intellectual property and licensing in corporations and innovation-based entrepreneurship. He's on the editorial board of several journals and has also widely consulted with industry. So welcome, Ashish. We have for you a total of 45 minutes, and we expect that you will present for about 30 minutes, and then the remaining 15 minutes we will spend time for comments and Q&A. Over to you, Ashish.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to be presenting on work that I've been doing with lots of colleagues, most prominently Sharon Belanzon, Leah Shear, who was a student here, who's now just started at Tel Aviv, J.K. Sir, who's a student here, and Andrea Pataconi at Norwich. You will also readily see my intellectual debt to Nate Rosenberg, to David Mowry, and to David Hounshell, who was for many years a colleague at Carnegie Mellon. Right, so Pankaj talked about the current issues, and as Naushad noted, I'm actually not going to be really, I'm going to spend a great deal of my time looking back to see how we got to where we are. So I guess a good way and I should also note that I am going to talk almost exclusively about the innovation ecosystem in America. I apologize for that. And in justification, I can say only that that's the only system that I've studied and I can speak to. And I'd be happy to learn more about other systems. But at this point, that's all that I know about. Right. So if we look at the American system, the part I want to focus on is the role of science in innovation, and put differently, the role of R in R&D. And so what you see here is that this has climbed steadily. And even as America continues to invest in scientific research, there's a sense that the returns on this have been falling. And a number of people have written about it, most notably Nick Bloom. And that's sort of the launching off point for what I'm going to talk about today. I said I'd be looking back, but I'm actually going to start in the middle of the story. And the middle of the story is somewhere around the 1980s. And if you looked at specifically at companies, what you'd find is that large American corporations have been steadily withdrawing from research. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a Bell Labs in 1963. This is the same facility in 2010. So this picture sort of summarizes, in a sense, the middle part of my story. More systematically, what this graph here shows is the blue lines is corporate publications of all publicly traded American headquartered companies, normalized by sales. And you can see a fairly steady decline in this blue line. This red line is the number of patents for the same companies for the same time period, also normalized by sale. And you can see somewhere around the early 90s, there's a divergence. And there's this pulling away from research, but at least if you believe, forgive me, if you believe if you think of patents as capturing the D of R&D, this tells you that there was no decline in that part of R&D. So that's sort of the middle point. In some sense, that's how I got into this story of trying to understand why corporate research was declining. And that helped me pull in some of this work others had done, and I had done a little bit of thinking about how the innovation ecosystem was organized. And I'll come back to this story towards the end of my talk. So this is a very brief potted history of the American innovation system. The periodization is pretty arbitrary, and don't hold me to the dates. But here's the basic start. If you start in the middle of the 19th century, in 1850, America is already a pretty rich country by then. And certainly by World War I, it has become the richest country in the world. What's interesting about it is during much of this time, America is a scientific laggard, and in many respects, a technical laggard as well. There's a period of change in the early part of the 20th century. And really what's called the golden age, and I'm calling it here the golden age of corporate research, is the post-war period, the sort of the 3-4 decades after World War II, which has shaped not only a lot of what America is, but more importantly, how economists and policymakers have thought about innovation. And I would submit to you that that experience has powerfully shaped how we even today continue to model and think about innovation. And to come to the present, I would say somewhere around the mid-1980s, this innovation system started to show clear signs of change. The research universities became more important as sources of ideas and inventions, sometimes by startups. And this also coincides with the beginning of the decline of corporate research labs. And that's where my story currently ends. And I'll talk a little bit about what that might mean, at least in the American context. So very quickly, this is America's rise to riches. Probably the first industry that was technically sophisticated and complex was the railroads. And Steve Usselman, who has studied innovation of the railroads, points out where the inventions came from. And for the most part, if you think about new product ideas, they came from independent inventors, and you might think of it as shop floor inventions. Systematic inventions, for the most part in America, were process innovations to unlock scale economies. And Naushad this will resonate with Naushad. To the extent that companies were investing in science, they were essentially hiring scientists to evaluate external technology, materials testing, and so on. And if you read Andrew Carnegie's biography, he mentions how hiring a chemist greatly improved productivity. He says, we found, and I'm quoting, we found a learned German Dr. Frick, and great secrets did the doctor open up to us. Or from mines that had a high reputation was found to contain 10, 15, and even 20% less iron than had been credited with mines that had hitherto a poor reputation. And he goes on. The point being, this is the time when America grew rich, I would argue mostly by borrowing from the outside, adapting that technology, and scaling it up to suit its domestic market conditions, and it did so very successfully. If you look at this picture here, this is from Lamoureux and Sokolov, and the point of this picture is this: what it shows is the percentage of patents that were traded or reassigned, and this top line is America, and this is Britain. And the takeaway here is there was an active market for technology. There was an active market for invention because the inventions were coming from independent inventors who were then trading it and selling those inventions to established producers. And for a historical record, you can look at both Naomi Sokolov and her work, and Steve Usselman's detailed history of innovation in railroads. Universities, American universities, on the whole, were weak, focused on undergraduate education, and systematic research was rare. And I won't walk you through all the pictures here, but you can see here that federal support, which is this red bar in this picture, in this graph at the bottom, was minuscule compared to internal funds, which is this green part, and state and local and other sources of fund, which is the gray part in the middle. So the modern research system in America, as we know it, is entirely a creature of World War II and what happened after that. During this time, companies were slowly getting into research. This picture here of this shed is the beginning of GE research labs, probably the first corporate research lab. And this is Steinmetz's private research laboratory. And this picture on the left is when Einstein toured RCA's wireless station in 1921. And this guy here is Steinmetz, who started GE Labs. This is Einstein, Irving Langmuir, who worked for GE Research and got a Nobel Prize in chemistry. And this guy back here is David Sarnoff. So you can see corporate research in America had fairly humble, modest beginnings. And in many cases, they remained that way. for example, at Western Union, that remained the case. This quote from the guy who ran R&D at AT&T in 1885 is interesting. So the R&D function at AT was called the patent department. And the quote is interesting. He says, "I'm fully convinced that it has never, is not now, and never will pay commercially to keep an establishment of professional inventors or men whose chief business it is to invent." So what was the role of the R&D group? It was to examine patents or inventions submitted by the public for consideration. And secondly, on examining descriptions of inventions forwarded by the company's employees. This tells you what the innovation ecosystem in America was, and which even a very large, sophisticated company such as the Bell Telephone Company, how they viewed where their inventions were going to come from. And as I indicated with the Carnegie Lab, Carnegie quote, the role of corporate lab was testing, quality control, troubleshooting, and evaluating external technology. But slowly, for example, as in GE, they started towards creation of new products and processes to fuel corporate growth. Why was that? Well, many things. As usual, these things are overdetermined. There was this big scientific opportunity, lots of developments, and companies had to try to keep up with them. There was foreign competition. World War I was really the chemist war and showed what science applied to economic purposes could accomplish. And this large and rapidly growing market, and by 1914, America is the richest country in the world. It is essentially a unified market, which the European Union is now trying to accomplish. That was already the case by 1914 in America. And so you have this massive opportunity, a scientific opportunity, an economic opportunity, and large companies, some of them chose to grow by investing in research, partly because the antitrust regime, which was a little bit inconsistent, also made it very difficult to grow through other means, such as acquisitions. By 1940, so towards the end of the transition period, corporate labs were in fashion. These were the four pioneers: Charles Stein at DuPont, Willis Whitney at GE, Frank Jewett at Bell Labs, and Ken Meese in Kodak, whom George Eastman had lured away from England because of his expertise in color chemistry. And you can see here, these are David Mowry's data. You can see here the tremendous growth in scientists and engineers in industrial research lab, in manufacturing, scaled by output. This is important. This is scaled by output. So even as these firms and industry grew large, so if you look at, for example, the bottom one here, chemicals, the share grew from 5 scientists and engineers per 1,000 workers to 27, a 5-fold increase. Likewise, in petroleum, in electrical machinery, instruments, you can see much larger percentage increases, although in absolute levels, they were smaller. And the success of these companies, these were massively successful companies, the Deca unicorns of their times. This stimulated a lot of follow-on imitation. Many companies started industrial research labs. This is a poster I got from David Hounshell, and this is the DuPont, a mural from the DuPont Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair. And this is industrial research as progress. This was art. These guys were feted and lionized as pointing towards the future. And then to add, we get World War II, which was in some ways the physicists and the chemical engineers' war, and very significant advances in these are well known, so I won't spend time on them. You know, the atom bomb, the large scale purification of penicillin, the first computer, radar, and of course that ends with this famous pamphlet by Vannevar Bush called Science, the Endless Frontier. It's interesting, there is now the Endless Frontier Act going through Congress in the United States, which will massively increase funding for science and technology, sort of a second big push, if you like. As I had indicated, the post-war period was the period of the golden age of corporate research. You can see here pictures of these central research labs. And they epitomize the belief that basic research was the source of fundamental new innovations. That this is where companies would find the fantastic new products that would lead them to future growth and glory. David Hounshill always talked about it as the search for the next nylon. If you remember, nylon was the first big product innovation that came out of DuPont's research, and DuPont spent probably the next 40 years searching for the next big one. And of course, the federal government played a big role. A lot of these labs also worked as subcontractors for government research projects. And the NSF was founded. So there was a lot of stuff happening. It's not just companies that are doing it, but there was a whole milieu that was supporting these developments. Corporate researchers made significant contributions to advancing scientific knowledge. There were, I've listed some of these. There were 9 Nobel Prizes and 14 Nobel Prize winners at Bell Labs alone. Right? And Bell Labs was not the only one, of course, but certainly the most famous. And of course, they made very substantial contribution to technology as well. This is my iPhone, and all the major components came out of research that was done at Bell Labs. Solid state electronics, which led to the transistor, lasers, which were initially by Skowlau and co-authors with Charles Towns at Columbia. And without lasers, you would not get the advanced microchips. And you probably also would not get fiber optic communication. And of course, cellular networks, which were also invented here. And you can see, before I skip, some of that momentum inertia still remains. Xerox PARC, of course, is a pale shadow of itself. Microsoft research remains a large, significant enterprise, but I'm convinced that it's the beginning of the end for Microsoft research in its traditional form. With the new CEO, Satya Nadella, I predict that Microsoft research will definitely go the way of, will most likely go the way of IBM research. In that it'll become much, much more applied. So that gets us to the launching point, which is the decline of corporate research. And if you don't remember anything else, just remember this. Economists tend to use R&D as if it were one word, but it's really two. There's research and there's development. And what we've been seeing over the last 3 decades has been less R and more D. And this is the graph. This is from NSF. Most of what I've done is looked at corporate publications. The NSF collects confidential data where they ask companies to break up R research into R and to D. And this is the share, this blue line is the share of research in business R&D. And it reached its peak of around 30% or 28% in the mid-90s. And it's now probably around 21, 22%, and it's been pretty flat over the last 10 years. And if you look at privately funded business R&D, this blue line would be lower and would have declined a little bit more. And the same picture is shown in this graph, which I had discussed earlier. Now, at this point, you could ask, well, maybe it's because research or science has become less useful for industrial purposes. And it's hard to judge systematically. One way you could do is look at citations by patents to the scientific literature. And so that's what we have here. These are data from the National Science Foundation. And we've confirmed these data in our own research as well. So what this shows is roughly about a quarter of US patents cite science. Roughly a quarter. Now there are many interpretations of this, but it's at face value, this is inconsistent with the idea that science has become less useful for industrial purposes. And if you look at the share of articles that are cited, and that's this top line here, that's been pretty stable. Well, it's increased since the 2000, and it's around 2.2 to 2%, somewhere in that ballpark. So this says science continues to be useful, but the second chart says it's privately less valuable to invest in science. And so what you have here is the elasticity of the stock market value. So essentially, imagine correlating the stock market value after netting out various assets on the balance sheet. And so this is you can think of as a Tobin-Q regression. And what this tells you is this light colored bar was the elasticity of the stock of the scientific publications of the company with its market value between 1980 and 1992. And this dark bar was the same elasticity with respect to the stock of patents. So what this says is before 1992, companies that were investing in the production of science were valued by investors. Okay. After 1992, the situation flips. Patents are valuable. The elasticity is about 4%. So if you double the stock of patents, your Tobin's Q or your stock market value, adjusting for the book value of assets, goes up by 4%. But publications are not. And before 1992, publications were, the elasticity is about 10%. So what have we seen? We've seen, one, that science remains valuable. So you can think of it as the social value of science. You can think of this as the private value as seen by investors. And if I can go back to this picture here, this tells you, consistent with this periodization, that the value of investing in science as seen by managers is falling. So managers think investing in science is less valuable. Investors agree investing in science is less valuable. But from a societal viewpoint, investments in science remain useful, at least as measured by their use in patents. All right. So this is the beginning of if you like, where we're now. Now the question is, what does all this mean? Why did this happen, and how can we reconcile this? Let me just quickly acknowledge that this picture of decline is not uniform, that there are specific exceptions. A notable one is AI research, where companies such as Google and Microsoft and others are investing in it in a very significant way. And one could argue that there's a very good reason that these companies have a very clear advantage in such research because it's directly tied to their products. And more importantly, they have the key resource for this research, which is large-scale data. I'll say a little bit more on that as well. So now the question, why did this happen? And how can we make sense of the fact that science continues to be useful, but companies don't find it privately valuable to invest in it? This is a cheap dig at my finance colleagues, well, also my strategy colleagues, but let me get to what I think is a reasonable list of explanations. One idea that's been going around now is that there's too much competition. And conversely, there is the opposite, where there's not enough competition, that the rise of monopoly power, the growth of sort of superstar firms is behind this decline. Nick and others, Bob Gordon most prominently, have put forward this notion that maybe we've plucked all the low-hanging fruit, and further advances in science are going to be that much harder, that there are fewer and fewer big breakthroughs. There is this idea that modern financial capitalism is becoming more short-termist. I cannot, and I have not systematically analyzed these possible explanations. Let me say, what I want to do is focus on a different potential explanation, which is that the innovation ecosystem in America is changing, and that it's characterized with the growth of universities. If you remember, American universities were weak, and increasingly now they're producing the ideas commercialized by startup. There is a new market for technology. And last one idea, which I won't be able to spend time on, is that managing research inside firms was always a huge challenge. And companies are coming to the view that it's not an activity that they can manage well. Rakesh, how am I doing on time?
Another 5 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. I'll be done by then. All right, so let me just quickly take you through this idea of this new division of labor. There are different parts. So the top one talks about universities, and this line, this dotted red line at the top, is the gross royalties that universities have earned, normalized by the total R&D, academic R&D. And you can see this has increased steadily from around 0.5% to now about 4%. It has declined a little bit toward the end of the period, and I'm not sure what that is, but you can see the general trend is up. And this tells you about university patenting. This is increasing as well. And this table on the bottom left tells you about companies, the licensing revenues that companies are increasing. In 2002, this is from the US Census Bureau. In 2002, licensing revenues were 66 billion. And in 2011, the latest date for which these figures are available, they had not quite doubled to about $111 billion. And of course, it hardly need be said that a lot of what universities do is being commercialized by startups, and there's been enough talk about startups, so I don't have to say more. Here is the results of a survey of American manufacturing, not just R&D, but all manufacturing that we did for 2007, 2009. Here's the punchline. 50% of the new products companies reported as having introduced during this period came externally, came from outside. In a number of cases from their customers and suppliers, but at least in about a quarter of the cases came from what you might think of as technology suppliers, independent inventors, universities, and so on. Consistent with this, there's been an increase in collaboration and in contract R&D. So one way to think about this, and initially that was sort of much my thinking as well, was this is what you ought to expect, that if you go back to Adam Smith, as capitalism progresses, you get a deeper division of labor. Innovation was one part of the economy that seemed to have defied this trend, where there was vertical integration between the commercializers and the inventors. And now we're seeing the unraveling of that vertical integration, and we're seeing a progressive division of labor in innovation itself. And so to the extent that specialization and division of labor is associated with productivity increase and growth, this ought to be a good thing. The question is, are we missing something? And I believe we are. And I believe that the current system that's evolving is too narrow, and that the decline of the large corporate lab has left a gap. And the specific gap is in what you might think of as deep tech or hard tech. And we can perhaps talk about it in the Q&A in more detail, where you can see here, for example, VC investment is very heavily focused in either software or in life sciences. And things like materials, energy storage, biofuels, ag tech, carbon sequestration, these are all sectors which appear to be neglected in this new system. And here's one reason, which is corporate research is much larger. You can put together much larger teams. It's mission oriented. You can put together different disciplines. So if you think of Google Translate, it required linguists, machine learning experts, and statisticians. And that's typically where universities would stop. It would require software engineers to translate algorithms into efficient code, database experts to manage those large databases, hardware designers and engineers. In fact, this is the chip that Google had to develop to do Google Translate. This is a TPU. And without it, you could not get Google Translate. This kind of stuff is very hard to pull off outside a corporate lab. It's very hard to pull it off in this current decentralized Smithian division of labor. And I've already talked about the narrowness of the VC investments. So I'm going to stop here, if you like, and say large companies are withdrawing from research. It's extremely unlikely that they would return, that we're going to get corporate research back, perhaps with a couple of exceptions. What we are going to get for the foreseeable future is what I've called the division of innovative labor, where you have universities, startups, and incumbent firms. And this has, I suggest to you, changed the direction of innovation, particularly in where you have more complex products. And we could think about what might be done, but I'm out of time. Let me stop here and open it up.
Thank you very much, Ashish. This is very nice. I mean, since I had read the paper, I got much more out of the presentation than many others. I would very strongly recommend that people read the paper because it has very, very interesting details. So there are a few questions. One question is from Reggie Joseph. And the question is that given the fact that you see some kind of a decline in the share of corporate R&D in the US, how do you see the MNC R&D labs coming up in different countries? Does that partly compensate for the decline in their share in the US R&D?
So thank you. Just a quick clarification. There's not been any decline in R&D. What has happened is a change in composition with companies moving away from R towards D. And some of the R has moved to outside the company's boundaries, such as in universities or much less to startups. So startups typically don't do any research. The question of the globalization of R&D labs, undoubtedly there's some, but I would submit to you that the problem is not where the R&D is performed. It's not, let me be more direct. It's not a matter of an increase in the cost of inputs. So much of the globalization is the search for the same quality of inputs at lower cost. The data I presented are inconsistent with that explanation. So it's if companies were withdrawing because the research inputs had become more expensive, the marginal research project would be more valuable, not less valuable. And what you've seen here is that it's less valuable.
There is a question from Pankaj. He's asking what were the dominant sources of research funds between 1940 and 1980 versus the post-1980 period. Did that play a critical role in the decline of corporate R?
So that's something we're looking at. That's a good point, because the federal government also moved away from funding large-scale research, because this period coincides with the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the early evidence that my colleagues have gathered suggests that there is possibly, that could be part of the explanation. But if you see, Pankaj, if you see even privately or internally funded research, you see the same trends. Now, it could be that internally funded research was complementing federally funded research. And so the decline of federal research could have caused this. And I cannot say definitively one way or the other. I suspect that's certainly possible.
Okay, so there is a question from Juhi Jain. She's asking, US government runs a large number of nationwide innovation challenges. Do these challenges play an important role in promoting R&D and commercialization?
I think they do. I have not studied any of these in any detail, so mine is a very impressionistic, will be an impressionistic answer. I suspect we don't need these for let's say the software broadly defined. I include in all the web apps and all that kind of stuff. So software and life sciences, I think, are doing very well under the current system. There's absolutely no shortage of funds, of private funds for research in this, even in the most unlikely sorts of areas of research, such as, for example, reprogramming cells so that people won't grow old and won't die. It's really interesting to see what people are doing. And private capital is getting invested in that. And likewise, you know how much is happening in artificial intelligence, machine learning, that sort of stuff. The part that's missing, as I suggested, the gap, that is more complicated, and I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure these challenges help, but I don't think they're a complete solution or even remotely adequate for the gap.
There is a question from Ribhu Deo. You talk about this in your paper, but you didn't spend as much time here. What he's asking is, can research collaboration between corporate and universities be one of the probable way forward? In that case, would there be a likelihood for sponsored research content and compromise on independence, like plastic industries and so on?
Yeah, that's a good point. I have a student who's beginning a dissertation on this topic. So we don't really know too well about this. Well, there's been a lot written on it, but at least I don't fully understand what companies are hoping to accomplish and how they're hoping to accomplish by moving research to universities to substitute what they were doing internally. In some ways, collaboration with universities has been going on from the very start of corporate research. Carruthers came to DuPont from Harvard, and DuPont sort of doubled or tripled his salary and gave him much more equipment. So I think undoubtedly corporate collaboration between companies and universities would be important and useful. My own experience in this has been that companies that don't do research internally are very different partners for a university researcher than companies that do have functioning internal research. And so you can think about what that would imply in terms of whether collaborations could or could not fill the gap. My guess is probably not, that companies would collaborate with universities in research when they themselves are doing research. And as I've suggested, university research projects have a very different flavor from corporate research. The Google Translate example being sort of the main canonical example of that point.
There is a question, I think I'll take two more questions, otherwise we won't have much time. So there is a question from Naushad. He's saying Ashish would be familiar with Nate Rosenberg's work. Why do firms do basic research with their own money? What's changed for them to stop? His argument was that it was a ticket of admission to accessing the research done elsewhere. Exactly the issue Ashish is raising right now. Would that still not apply?
It does. It's a really interesting point. And something we've been working on recently. An interesting point is this, Naushad. I think Nate's point was certainly that knowledge is not on the shelf, and in particular, knowing what works and what doesn't, or what's relevant to university research, you need to have internal capacity. The issue is, once somebody has used it, do you still need that internal capacity? So once Amgen, for example, figures out that you can produce EPO using this research at the University of Chicago, the next person doesn't need that same internal capacity to do it. And what this means is there's potentially significant externalities in even the use of public research. And my own take is that companies are increasingly of the view that they want to completely outsource, not outsource is the wrong word, but to step away from that act of experimentation. Let startups do that. And then when startups are more successful, show some promise or market viability, to acquire them or to acquire the technology.
Okay, the last questions. I'm combining three questions now. One question is from Madhukar, who's saying that if you go with the historical precedents, you will see in crisis situations, significant work gets done. So the post-World War story and the current crisis might lead to something similar. And linked to this question are two other questions. One from Farhad, who's saying, with Biden administration in place, would you see more federal funding happening? And what is your view on the current controversy regarding patents around COVID cures?
So it's true that crisis does tend to focus the mind. I would also say that it doesn't lead to what it leads to are viable technical solutions, not necessarily scientific breakthroughs. Penicillin was discovered much earlier. What World War II accomplished was the large-scale purification. Same way, the search for synthetic rubber. The US government launched a synthetic rubber program during World War II. They did not develop synthetic rubber. They developed GRS-5, which was pretty good. Same with the atom bomb. The Manhattan Project was a giant engineering project. So the way I would think about it is that crisis situations will lead to very significant technical, practical advances. What it will do to research is more of an open question. This new administration certainly promises to increase funding both for research and for technology on a large scale. Whether that happens, we'll see. And for patents, I'm not an expert in this area specifically of vaccine research. My sense is that IP, intellectual property, is not the limiting factor here. That the rate limiting factor here is the ability to produce to actually produce and scale up on an acceptable scale virus, the vaccine. So. I don't see it as a first order problem.
Okay, I think we need to, you're right. I mean, personally, I also think that manufacturing other capabilities with the new kind of vaccines, countries like India don't have that. So ramping up would be a big issue. Anyway, so thank you very much, Ashish. I see many more questions about the Bayh-Dole Act and things like that, but I don't think we have the time. If you are still there after Nick's presentation, we can take on some of these questions. But otherwise, thank you very much. I'm sure all of us enjoyed it. Thanks very much, Ashish.
I'll stick around.
Yeah. Janak, has Nick joined?
Yeah, hey Rakesh.
Hi, Nick. Good to see you.
Sorry, it's very early in the morning. It's like
yeah, it must be really early for you. So after this fascinating presentation by Ashish, we are now I'm pleasure to introduce the next speaker for us, Nick Bloom. He is the William Eberle Professor of Economics at Stanford, a senior fellow of SAPER, and the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of Sloan Fellowship, the Berners Prize, the Frisch Medal, and the National Science Foundation Career Award. So I can go on and on. His current research focuses on working from home, management practices, and uncertainty. So over to you, Nick. We have 45 minutes for you, so we expect you to finish your presentation in about half hour, and then we'll take comments and questions.
Thanks very much, Rakesh. Lovely to follow Ashish. So I'll share my screen. I'm going to co-present with, I'll go first, but my co-author Rakesh is going to do basically kind of the second half. And then, yeah, if anyone has questions during, feel free to stop, but also happy, obviously, to discuss these afterwards. So why don't I get my slides set up? So I'm going to talk, I need to get this into full screen mode. So this is joint work with Tariq Hassan, Rakesh, who will talk, Josh Lerner, and Ahmed Tahoun. I'm going to talk about the diffusion of disruptive technologies. So before that, I should start by thanking Nashad and Janek, who I've been working, I can see Mega's on the call too. We've been working with Mega, a group of us, for some time on management practices in India and doing some India-US comparisons. So I should thank them very much for the support, and it's been great working with them over the last few years. So the paper connects two literatures. So there's one literature which is about inequality. How is technology concentrated, how the benefits concentrated by skill level and geography. In fact, it's going to connect a little bit to what Ashish was talking about in terms of universities. But, you know, there's a question in the US and more globally is technology just generating a bunch of high paid jobs for university or college graduates and putting the rest of the workforce out of work? So is it increasing inequality? there's a huge literature on that. When I teach my Stanford grad students labor economics, the first 3 or 4 lectures is always on this. And then there's a very different topic, but I think is really interesting, both again in India and in the US, is about regional development. And in fact, this in many ways is more connected, even more connected to what she's talking about, is, you know, how does technological activity spill from universities into firms? How do you generate the next Silicon Valley? You know, what's the kind of things you want to be boosting your region? In the US, there's obviously a few high-tech regions, most particularly Silicon Valley, but also one around Boston, one around Austin in Texas, one in Pittsburgh. You know, if you want to be that, how do you get to be that? And so this paper is going to do a couple of things. It's going to use text-based measures of exposure to almost 30 technologies, looking at patterns, looking at jobs, and then use this to study the spread of technologies. So why don't I tell you the results, and I'll go back and I'll kind of give you a brief overview of what we do. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at new technologies, 29 new technologies we call disruptive technologies. So one example is the cell phone, or in fact the what's called the iPhone, the smartphone. And I'm going to use that as an example to explain what we find. So for new disruptive technologies, think of the smartphone. The initial hiring is concentrated in high-skilled jobs in geography. So the bottom left, you think of when Steve Jobs started Apple, most of the initial jobs around the smartphone were out in Silicon Valley. That's the scientists and engineers designing this stuff. So the iPhone came out in 2007. So for the first, 2000 to 2007, probably those early years, almost all the jobs were scientists, engineers out in Silicon Valley. Over time, down here, by the way, this is a photo of Apple's first building. That's the initial headquarters. Over time, these jobs spread out. So you think of, the smartphone came out in 2007. By 2012, the AT&T stores across the US selling these things. There's a lot of people working in these stores as manufacturing jobs. So this is skill broadening. These jobs spread out down the skill chain. Most people working at AT&T stores are not university graduates. They also spread out across the US. Most of these stores are not in Silicon Valley, they're across the country. But it's also the case that the original technology hub retains an advantage. So for anyone that's been out here, for all of us, I know quite a few people here have been out to Silicon Valley. If you fly from Stanford campus south, so if you're flying ever to Mexico, South America, you'll pass over this thing on the bottom right, which is Apple's headquarters, and it's in Cupertino, and it looks like an enormous spaceship. So this thing, really exists. When you look out the side of the plane, it's this vast circular building that has apparently 10,000 people working in it. This shows you that even though Apple jobs are spread out across the country, the original technology hub, Silicon Valley, retains a big advantage. Many of the jobs have stayed here. And these hubs are more likely around universities, more likely in educated areas, which connects very much to what Ashish was talking about. So, there's a large literature. I won't go on. What I'm going to talk about is how we define disruptive technologies and talk about, skill broadening, region broadening. Then I'll pass over to Rakesh that will talk from section 4 onwards. The other angle you can take this paper is a kind of a paper on text to data. So text to data has exploded in terms of research interest. Many of the grad students here are working on text to data. So if you're kind of interested in text to data, there's a few main text to data sets we're going to talk about. So we got 3 main data sources. One is earnings calls. So these are discussions of quarterly earnings by about 12,000 US publicly listed firms. So since what's called Regulation Fair Disclosure in 2001, I think it was, there's been quarterly earnings calls to some companies. Normally the CEO, CFO, maybe head of public relations, gets onto the telephone and does, a public telephone call. Maybe now a lot of them doing Zoom calls, whereby they go through for about 20, 25 minutes presentation on the company's quarterly results, and they take Q&A for 20, 25 minutes. The second data set is going to be online jobs posting from Burning Glass. They basically have pretty much all online jobs postings for the last kind of 12 years. And thirdly is going to be patterns. So let's start with earnings calls. We have the complete transcript of around 300,000 US earnings calls from 2002. Firms, because these are quarterly, have 4 a year. There's a management presentation followed by a Q&A for analysts. lasts about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. There's average about 8,000 words. And I put this picture on the right to show these things matter. This was a famous Facebook earnings call I think it was 2017 or 2018. Basically, it's the biggest single drop in a company's valuation in one day. They, at the earnings call, released some bad news for Facebook, and Facebook dropped by $120 billion in a couple of hours, which is just immense. So you can actually see here, Facebook starts the earnings call at 4 p.m. Pretty rapidly in the presentation by the company, there's some bad news, the stock price drops. Presentation carries on. In response to one Q&A, they reveal yet more bad news, the stock price drops further. So these are real things. They're important for firms. They care about this. And there's 8,000 words of text, both pre-scripted and also Q&A. So there's kind of useful information here. So here's an example. Here's an earnings call for Microsoft with their CEO Satya Nadella. They're also joined by Amy Hood, who's the CFO, and Michael Spencer, who is the corporate relations. And you can see there's loads of people from investment companies, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank, RBC, Stanford, Bernstein, etc. And what happens is they just go through this. So the Satya Nadella is talking, and then goes through, and you can say it was another strong quarter, blah blah blah. Talks for a while, and then they get to Q&A. So you can see operator 22. There's different questions, different responses, different questions. So there's a lot of text in this. So that's one set of text. Second set of text is online jobs posting from Burning Glass. So here's an example jobs posting. This is for hybrid electric cars. So you can see here that it has various kind of clear categories where it is, what the job title is, the date, but then all the text, and the text is what we're going to scrape here. So it talks about what the job is about. Here's another one that has much more text here. You can see it has a discussion of the job. We're going to scrape this text. This text is much dirtier than earnings calls because it hasn't been cleaned up, and there are literally hundreds of millions of these ones. But again, you can scrape these texts. What do they talk about in the text? What do they mention? And then finally, patents. So here's a classic patent. We're going to scrape patents. Again, scrape the text and the abstract of the patent, in the main body of the patent, the title, etc. So what do we do? So the first thing is we're going to define technology keywords from patents. So we're going to take all bigrams, and bigrams are two-word combinations like cloud computing or cloud infrastructure or smartphone or electric car. And there are 17 million of them from US patents. So we're going to scrape all patents over the 50-year period, and there are 17 million patents. Then we're going to remove all the stop words and also any other bigrams that are commonly used in English. So like, tomorrow we, or something like that. If we're going to, in a sentence, tomorrow we will go to the park, we'll just remove the bigram tomorrow we. And we take this from what's called the Corpus of Historical American English. It's just a large corpus of American English. It gets rid of common non-technical bigrams. We're also going to remove any bigrams that occur in patents with less than 1,000 citations in total. So we're left with 35,000 technical bigrams. This is two-word conversations, two words that are associated with influential inventions. We then take these, and we only keep those that increase in frequency during earnings calls over the sample. So we're going to then match them to earnings calls and require these bigrams to arise in earnings calls, so companies to talk about them, and that their maximum occurs within the sample period, and it's more than 10 times the minimum within the sample period. So basically here, by the end of this, we have 305 bigrams that are mentioned quite a few times in importantly cited patents, are mentioned in earnings calls, and that discussion is rising over time. So you can think of these as recent technologies. And if you look at them, they're things like mobile devices, machine learning, cloud computing, cloud services, quality metrics, low profile smartphones, kind of sensible work. And then finally, we got to put these into technologies. So there are two ways to go. One is what I'm going to call supervised. There's a little emblem of a person here. This is kind of a human approach. I guess it's my preference, whereby as a research team with a huge amount of reading online on Wikipedia, MIT technology review, Gartner review, all kinds of stuff, we grouped the bigrams of similar meanings into 29 specific technologies, and I'll show you what these are in a minute. The alternative is to treat each bigram itself as a technology and run regressions, and that's more of a robustness test, and it gives similar results. But we, with these, if I focus on this, the more human intuitive version, we take these bigrams and we manually cluster them. We drop ones like global warming or identity theft, which are not technologies. We drop a few like NAND flash, which refers to an older technology, but had a supply crunch. So that's why it came up in earnings schools. We're left with 105 technical bigrams into 29 technologies. And things like cloud computing, smart devices, social networking, search engineer, virtual reality, autonomous cars, etc. So if I took at social networking as an example, the bigram is social networks, social networking, active user, user behavior. These tend to be discussions about social networking. If you look at search engine or virtual reality, you can see these are basically fields of technology. To remind you, these are all technologies that are heavily discussed in patents, so they're patented. They're technologies that are talked a lot about in earnings calls, and that usage is increasing over time. And then we do some final checks. We look for false negatives, maybe bigrams we've missed. So we do what's called embedding vectors. So we look in earnings calls for other bigrams that look like the one we're discussing. So for example, we picked up that machine learning and deep learning are similar to artificial intelligence. So we add that in. So I think that's all part of artificial intelligence. And we also look for false positives, bigrams that in job adverts appear to not really be about the technology. So for example, video games, you may think that's a bigram about video games. If you go to job adverts, quite often it doesn't really talk about them as a technology. Here it says, do you enjoy playing video games or computer games with a joystick, in terms of recruiting a truck driver. So this isn't really about the technology of coding video games or making video games. It's just completely incidental to something else. So we drop bigrams that tend to generate what we call a lot of false positives. So we're going to end up with 29 technologies. Here's some examples. So for example, 3D printing is a technology. It's a relatively recent, and it would be, it seems a classic disruptive technology. It's come about in the last 15 years. It's taken off. It's growing rapidly. It's new. It is disrupting some industries it's in. And here are the keywords: 3D printing, 3D printer, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, 3D printed, etc. Autonomous car, another big local one. I'm looking out the window in Silicon Valley, and I just see tons of Teslas, driverless car, autonomous car, driverless truck, fracking, computer vision, etc., etc. So these are the 29 technologies. These are some examples, and this is how we go. So I'll pause. Are there any, Rakesh, are there any questions, or I can interrupt if there are any questions, otherwise I can keep going. So on technology, we're going to define a job as exposed to a technology if it mentions that bigram. So remember, we have these hundreds of millions of online jobs. If they ever mention a bigram in the job advert, in the text, we're going to define it as exposed. So if halfway through the text, it talks about driverless car, we're going to define that as exposed to that broad driverless car technology. And having looked at a lot of jobs, the main reason they're exposed is either they're using the technology. So it might say, you are going to be riding in a driverless car and taking photos, or because they produce it. So you are going to work in Tesla's driverless car technology. So either way, you're kind of exposed to that technology, either through producing it or using it. That accounts for about 90% of job ads. So here's one for machine learning. See, this is a job of applied research scientist in New York. And you can see it mentions various machine learning. Machine learning itself is mentioned multiple times. This is pretty heavily tagged: speech recognition, natural language processing. This is a job that's clearly about machine learning. So the computer tagged this as a machine learning job. We can then generate general exposure measures. How many of these jobs are mentioned in certain regions or technologies over time? So you can kind of see how we can get exposure to technology. So here's machine learning, just one example of occupations. If you look at the most exposed occupations, computer and information research scientists, 41% of their jobs, of the 190,000 job postings in Burning Glass, mention machine learning bigrams. So these people are completely exposed to it. Almost half of all job ads mention one of these bigrams, and then it drops off. At the bottom here, biological scientists are still heavily exposed. Almost 2% of biological scientists job ads mention something about machine learning. So this gives you a sense. And if you look down at lumberjack or factory worker, you'd find exposure share close to 0. So if you look at someone for a lumberjack or working in a factory or working in Walmart, they're basically not going to mention machine learning. And here's the number of job ads exposed over time. There was not much, it's pretty flat. And then around 2015-16, machine learning really starts to take off. You see it. This is earnings schools. You see companies really start to talk about it. In the last few years, machine learning and AI has become a big issue for companies. So if you go back to 2010, there's not much discussion, kind of early stage technology, but it's not really mainstream. Last 3 or 4 years, it's really started to matter. So if we pick up our cell phones, there's a lot of AI now driving apps in our cell phones and computers in things that we're actually using on a daily basis. And we define the start date here as the date at which, in earnings call, this reaches 10% of its max. So it's a bit arbitrary, why 10%, why it's max, but in this case, it works reasonably well. It's a kind of, in some senses, a point of inflection. So whatever the maximum is in sample, often 10% seems to be the point of inflection where the technology is starting to take off. So we're going to define the start date, in a sense, or the kind of emergence date of machine learning in 2015. It's been around for a long time, but it really starts to emerge, becoming a mainstream technology around then. So here are the 29 technologies. You can see them laid out. Here's 3D printing. It's not much. Here's the start date. That looks about 2012. The emergence date starts to take off. It's actually dropped back a bit recently. But you can see clearly this is massively up. Here's autonomous cars, related to Tesla, for example, a lot of other autonomous car companies. Tesla is more directly is going to be hybrid electric cars, and this is also taken off. It kind of starts a bit earlier, etc. So you can see a lot of these technologies mostly look pretty sensible. Some, like smart devices, exploded earlier, dropped back a bit. They become so commonplace in some senses, it's less clear how disruptive they are anymore. Here's the number of jobs. Here's the circles and now the number of jobs. The red line is how much to discuss in earnings calls. The gray circles, number of jobs. You can see that they're pretty highly correlated. As earnings scores go up, the job posting seems to rise with it. So I'm going to go through the results reasonably quickly now, given time. So skill broadening. Over time, the share of college-educated people or university-educated, college is the American word, so university, I guess, would be the British and probably the Indian word. So the share of, college, university-educated people is declining over time since the birth of these technologies. So take, take smart devices. So, these are kind of cell phone type things. Early on, a lot of the jobs in this, 60% were people with a university degree. By now, 30% and falling of jobs using that over the university degree. So nowadays, most people with job postings are probably selling them, they're repairing them. They're not basically scientists and engineers. Early on, there's far fewer jobs. They tend to be very educated jobs. So you can see as the technology matures, jobs become less and less skilled. So in some ways, that's a good thing. Early on, a lot of the jobs go to, folks like us, to be honest, like university educated people, graduates, but over time it spreads out. You can do this in a regression. You just look at the share of people, is what I've been talking about. College education is highly negatively, significantly trending down with time. So years since the technologies emerged. Share of the post-grad, so, PhD, MBA, etc., also falling over time. The wages going, the years of schooling are going down. So in some senses, oddly enough, it's good news. It means that after technologies are born, the people working in them, using them or producing them slowly becomes less skilled. So the benefits spread out. What about region broadening? So we're going to look at, the normalized share of jobs in a region. What does that look like? That also falls over time. So if you look at smartphones, smart devices, early on, this is the coefficient of variation. There's a lot of variation early on. So the coefficient of variation means there's a few jobs in some places when it's high and very few jobs in the rest. So there's a lot of dispersion of jobs. As time goes on, jobs spread more and more evenly across the country. So the coefficient of variation across around 1,000 CBSAs, which is kind of spreads the entire of the US, falls, jobs spread out. So early on, you're going to see a lot of smart device jobs out in Silicon Valley. As time goes on, it spreads across the country. Again, you see it's pretty strongly, even fracking early on, it's in a couple of parts of the US. It's still quite concentrated. but even fracking is still spreading out across America. So there's quite a few places now across America that are fracking. You know, cloud computing was early on, again, another Silicon Valley area. You know, as time goes on, it spreads out. So here's region broadening, putting all technologies together. It's a very strong downward slope. Not surprising, this is highly significant. So the coefficient of variation has been falling over time. So this is the second core result. One is its technologies over time spread over skill levels. Secondly, they spread over regions. It turns out it spreads highest for low skilled. So low skilled jobs start off in technologies concentrated and rapidly disperse. High skilled jobs stick around a bit more. And this is going to prelude what Akash is going to talk about a bit, which is these original technology hubs retain some advantage. So Silicon Valley still has more, you know, cloud computing, more electric cars, more smart device jobs. So a lot of the low skilled jobs spread out, but many of the research scientists, you know, coming back to what Ashish was talking about, many of the research scientists do stick around the original universities and corporations. And there's obviously some, you know, challenges of Apple working with Stanford, for example, but Stanford, Berkeley, and a lot of the companies, universities still here, and a lot of the high skilled jobs are here. Some of them spread out, but less than the low skilled jobs. So at this point, I'll stop and pass over to Akash.
Okay. Thanks everyone for listening in. So we've already spoken about region broadening, but what we haven't spoken about is the actual identity of where these jobs actually originate. So, I mean, for that reason, we're going to define a technology hub as a location, as the set of locations which account for more than 50% of technology patents, about around 10 years before the start here, which we already spoke about. So as an example, like a lot of fracking patents are in Houston or in and around Houston. A lot of hybrid electric car patents are around Detroit, which for people who don't know is sort of like the auto manufacturing hub. Autonomous cars, is a combination of Detroit and Silicon Valley. So this sort of makes intuitive sense. Okay, and what we're going to look at is the normalized share, which Nick mentioned before, and regress that against the hub or the pioneer status of the location. And what we see is that there is a persistent advantage of these hubs in terms of technology hiring, but this advantage sort of dissipates in time or reduces in time. And I mean, you can sort of like get the ratio of these two coefficients and get that like the decrease in advantage is around 6.3% per year. So this sort of, I mean, goes back to what Nick was talking about in terms of region broadening, that there are these hubs or there are these locations where these jobs start and then spreads around the US, but the initial hub still maintains an advantage. Okay. And so similar to before, what there's an interaction of this region broadening effect with respect to skill, and especially so we do this for low, medium, and high skill occupations. And what we see is that the decrease in dissipation, so this is the same 6.7% as before, but the decrease in this sort of persistence of hubs effect is strongest for low skill occupations and sort of weakest for high skill occupations. So similar to the theme that there was before, that if you think about like research engineers or scientists or for machine learning or for smartphones, they will still be there in Silicon Valley, while you see the smartphone salespeople jobs spreading across the US. Right. Okay, so I mean, so we have sort of documented the region broadening stuff, but we haven't really spoken about the mechanisms behind the region broadening, and this is our first sort of step to narrow down the mechanisms. And what we do here is essentially a case study of Ford and GM. In the red bars, what you see is the jobs in Hub HQ, which for Ford and GM is Detroit. As I said, like it's an auto manufacturing hub, and it's sort of like the headquarters of Ford and GM. And so in red, we plot the total number of postings for Ford and GM before the technology sort of becomes relevant. In green, we plot it after the technology becomes relevant. And what you see here is the largest increase or the largest growth of jobs for both Ford and GM comes from postings in the hub. Now, so to sort of like connect this to the technology, what we do is in these black crosses, we plot the share of these green job postings which come from autonomous cars. And what you see is like a large chunk of the share, about 20% for Ford and about 60% for General Motors in the hub comes from these technologies. Right. So what this shows is that within the firm, there's some moving towards the hub to sort of get exposure to these technologies. I mean, we're trying to do some more systematic evidence, but this was like our first step to narrow down some of the mechanisms behind this broadening effect. What we also do is we try to find out like what are the characteristics of these hubs, and the first sort of obvious place to look for is whether these hubs are present around universities or like a lot of skill clusters. And to do that, what we do is like we correlate the patterns. So these are technology patterns which we use to define these hubs against the university presence. So in this case, we sort of correlate it with the university assets, university enrollment per capita. For the skill clusters, we do the share of postgraduate people in a particular CBSA, and also the share of college educated people in the CBSA. And what you see is like a positive, very strong positive correlation of these technology patterns against the skill presence or the university presence in a particular location. So what this basically tells you is that these hubs, which I was talking about, the origin places for these technologies, are actually present around skill clusters. And so this is like one of the characteristics. Now, we have spoken about regions, but we haven't, so they can be spread across other dimensions as well, specifically occupations, industries, and firms. So what we do here is a very similar analysis to before. So this is the exact same regression of coefficient of variation against the years since emergence of the technology, but now done for industries, occupations, and firms. So what you see in the bottom row here is that the spread of technology or the spread of technology job postings is largest across locations. A little bit lesser than that for firms, and then not so much and even insignificant across industries and occupations, right? So it's sort of natural to think that like these technologies spread across locations and firms, but not so much across industries and occupations. We do a very similar analysis to before again, where we define pioneer locations. And so we similarly define pioneer industries, occupations, and firms. And what we again find is very similar in the sense that like the largest, there is still persistent advantage for pioneers, but that dissipation or that reduction in persistent advantage is significant and largest for locations and smallest for and so sort of like largest for locations as compared to other dimensions through which the technology postings can spread. Right. And so finally, like before concluding, because like we are very close to time. So we want, as Nick mentioned before, we take two approaches towards sort of like establishing these or narrowing down these facts about technology spread. And the first approach was the manual approach, which we have sort of spoken about till now. We confirm all of the facts that we mentioned with the automatic approach, where we take the 305 diagrams as distinct technologies. And what you see again here is that qualitatively, even if you take these 305 diagrams separately as technologies, they exhibit region broadening, that the coefficient of variation decreases as the technology emerges. They experience, there's hub persistence, and there is skill broadening. Also, like the region broadening is much more significant for low skill occupations rather than high skill occupations. So basically, what the idea to do this was to ensure that none of our manual interventions sort of like were an important factor in generating the facts. We do a bunch of additional robustness checks because these are job postings collected by people. So we do a bunch of robustness checks to sort of ensure that none of the facts are determined by certain anomalies of the data. But before, so just let me conclude now, because I think I'm almost out of time. So what we do in this paper is that we introduce flexible measures of technology exposure at the firm, job, occupation level. We find that initial hiring in new technology is highly concentrated in high skill jobs. It sort of dissipates to lower skill levels, what we call as skill broadening. It sort of also broadens in terms of regions. We call that region broadening. And finally, there are hubs which retain advantage in hiring, especially for high skill jobs. And these hubs are located around universities and educated areas. That's it. any questions are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is a generic kind of a question from Madhukar Katiyar, and what he's asking is that can we really use the term disruptive technologies for the technologies that you have spoken about? Should they be called abrupt technologies, which appear suddenly? Because he's arguing that the digital computing is almost at the end point and quantum computing has emerged. So should we be talking about disruptive technologies or just talk about technology evolution?
I'm happy to, thanks for the question. I mean, disruptive is what the media's called them, and kind of commentators. I mean, you could argue they have different meanings. We're basically trying to look for technologies that are honestly newish in the last 15 years, new in terms of application. I mean, a lot of these things have been around forever. As you know, the electric car came first before the petrol engine. Like the electric car is more than 100 years old, but it was basically nothing and of no relevance really until the last 10, 15 years. So at that point, I visited Toyota's factory out in Japan and spoke to them and Denso about 2 years ago, and for sure the electric car is definitely disrupting what they're up to. So somebody typically is being disrupted. I agree, abrupt could, I'm not wedded to disruptive, it's just the word that the media tends to be using, so that's why I went to that. But yeah, you could call it other stuff. I think it's new. Honestly, you could talk about the main question here is trying to look at the impact of technologies. Makola asked something about inequality. I'll pause, but it's really looking at the impact of recent technologies on labor markets and who gains and who loses.
There's a question from Anurag Anand, and this is regarding the data construction part of the paper. He's asking, how did you aggregate various measures of technology adoption at the region and firm level? Could you please explain a bit about the technical and non-technical diagrams to identify influential technologies?
Akash, do you want to? Yeah, that might. Thanks.
Yeah. So aggregating to region and firm is essentially just based on burning glass identifiers. So burning glass basically has a job posting, and along with that job posting, it gives us a region. So where was the job posting? Where's the job located? And secondly, it also gives like an employer, let's say Facebook. And so once you target with a particular technology mention, it's just mechanical to sort of aggregate it up. And we rely on their region, which they give for the job posting. The other part about the technical and non-technical diagrams, what we sort of want to find out is newer technologies, right? So eventually that's the goal. We basically went to this collection of corpus of historical English, which is a collection of news, media articles, fiction, non-fiction books before the 1970s. So what we think is, so we think that if, let's suppose, a particular bigram was mentioned in news or in fiction or non-fiction books before the 1970s, then it's not relevant, so sort of kicking out that large bunch of biograms can help us in identifying new technologies or new technical keywords. And that's why we call it like the non-technical biograms. I mean, you cannot possibly go through the 17 million biograms in Pattern. So we had to narrow down the list to sort of go through it manually and then check which ones can be technologies, which one can be not. And so we applied this like gigantic filter and kicked out quite a few of the pattern biograms. Yeah.
So I should say, having, for example, with the work we're doing with Nashab, Janek, Mega, with the CTIER, is a lot of that's on management. And some of the non-technical biograms are pretty interesting. There are words like customer retention and social good and things that are clearly not in patents, but execs are talking about them a lot increasingly recently. So some of these terms are kind of like, you call it management buzzwords. And I think, Six Sigma is a real thing. I think it's more than a buzzword, but you see these words take off and they are interesting. The problem is they're wrapped up in a lot of other stuff. So there's almost a project I mean, maybe not if other people want to look at it. I should say all this text data is public. I mean, it's not like we have private access. It costs, but it's not enormously expensive. So I think the earnings calls, patents are free. Burning glass and the earnings calls you have to buy, but they're not that expensive, are great sources of information. So I'd strongly advise other people to look at it because text to data is fantastic in terms of the frontier of research. And we're not doing anything complicated, honestly. We're just using bigrams. It's not like some vast natural language processing computer code. We're just looking at bigrams because it turns out bigrams are a pretty effective way to describe what's going on in text.
Okay.
Another thing what we found is that when you look for non-technical bigrams in these job postings, you do not see a lot of incidents in them. So they're really, I mean, they're not as frequent as technologies. And so it's really hard to sort of talk about dispersion or anything like that for non-technical bigrams. But yeah, that's...
Okay, I think the last question, we have a question from Naushad. He's asking what would be desirable? Would it be more regions where we see these desirable jobs created and persisting, or would it be, would we be happy with what you found? That is, you have lower skill job creation in a wider scale.
It's a great question. It relates to it. Mikhail asked me something on private chat, and I said it's an excellent question as well for general. You know, I guess this desirable for whom? So there's an interesting difference here. So if you are, you know, I don't know, Biden or Modi, and you wanted to, you know, spread growth across the country, you probably want these jobs rapidly dispersing by geography and by skill level. So I know less about the Indian political situation, but in the US, there's been a long concern over inequality, rising levels of inequality. I think India has very high levels of inequality. And all of the concern is that these jobs, these high-skilled, high-tech jobs are all of, you know, all in Silicon Valley, all with people like, honestly, like, you know, me or people like me that have university degrees. So you want this stuff to spread out as fast as possible. So in some ways, this is a positive message. So sure, you know, Silicon Valley scientists get the jobs early on, but it does spread out. As Akash showed, it maybe takes 20 years to spread out an average. But if you think now, the original iPhone came out in 2007. By 2027, most jobs in iPhones are going to be across the country because most jobs are not going to be designing them, and most of the jobs are going to be selling them in AT&T or Verizon or using them. But you know, so there's probably 500,000 iPhone jobs by 2027, and they're probably pretty evenly dispersed. So in that sense, in the long run, the benefits spread out. There's an alternative take on it, which is you're a regional development agency. You are Silicon Valley, you are Boston. You don't want this stuff spread. You want to keep the jobs locally. So there's a bit of a tension. If I'm, you know, the California Regional Development Association, I actually want all my jobs staying around. And they do to some extent. There's a huge, you know, Josh Lerner much more works on this, but there's a huge policy area of how to kickstart, you know, Mumbai. I've been out to Mumbai many times, and how would you say, you know, push or Delhi, you know, their technology scene, and then maybe you want the high-tech jobs to stay there. If you know you're Maharashtra state government, you want to subsidize it. You don't want those jobs going away. So it's a great question. It's about who wants what, but I'd say overall we probably want jobs to spread out, and it looks like they partly do, and the low-skilled jobs spread out a lot, and the high-skilled jobs partly spread out and partly stick around.
Okay, there is another question. I think I'll take that to be the last one, which is linked to what you just said. This is Manish Sharma, and he's asking what are the policy suggestions you see based on outcomes of the paper, particularly in the context of international trade.
You know, again, it's very interesting. The policy suggestions, I guess, on the one hand, you know, there are some extreme policy suggestions, often from the left, about beating up on technology. You know, I heard my daughter was showing me on her, my oldest daughter's almost 18, was showing me her Instagram feed yesterday, loads of negative stuff about Bezos from Amazon, saying how he's evil and horrible and terrible and he earns all this money. And I'm like, wait a minute, you know, this guy is, it's not like I'm a defender of Bezos, but all of us used Amazon during the pandemic. And I'd much rather a world with Amazon than one without. And sure, he's earning $800 million a second, but, you know, I'm happy that that service is there. And so one policy, you know, you could argue that the benefits of Amazon are spreading out in terms of jobs and spreading out across society. So one policy question is to try and stop people destroying new technologies because these benefits spread out. I think the other policy angle is if you were, say, I don't know, you were Maharashtra state government and you were trying to, or Gujarat state government trying to subsidize local innovation, how might you go about it? How might you kickstart industry? And it appears that these hubs last for a while, but they don't last forever. So you know, Silicon Valley is great, but if you think of Detroit, actually, Akash mentioned Detroit. Detroit in the 60s was the tech capital of America. Cars were the hottest thing out. Now, you know, Detroit, the city, is pretty scary. You know, it's kind of depressed, you know, post-industrial city. So these hubs last, but they don't last for, you know, for 1,000. No, you know, Rome 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago was the technological capital of the world. I think, Mega, you're in Rome, aren't you, right now? I don't know how much high-tech stuff is coming out of Rome now. Once the, you know, some, but you know, these things come and go. But I think that's the other policy angle, what you do. And I think it suggests you can for 10 or 20 years spur local development, but it doesn't last forever. I mean, it comes back a lot to what Ashish is talking about, how to make the connections between firms and universities. I mean, I'll pause, but they're clearly connected. How to make the connections as well between firms and universities. And that's a lot of what policy is about. Silicon Valley has Stanford and Berkeley. I mean, Stanford in many ways was, you know, the key to this, and a lot of spin-offs happen to universities, but it is getting harder.
There are a couple of more questions, but I think we will, Nick, you have to go, I believe, right?
In about 10 minutes, yeah, I have to drive my daughter to school. Her school is restarted here. I know India's having a far worse COVID situation, but it's restarted here, but there's no buses or transport. So my wife and I are on like school driving rota.
In that case, we'll take one more question, which is from Arpan Chakravarti. And he's asking, does new skills like AI or ML in the resume work like signaling for the new technology employment?
Probably, by the way, we don't look at, it's a great question. There is a separate database of resumes. And I don't know, Akash, whether Burning Glass have, we're not looking, so just to be clear, you can definitely look at resumes and there's yet more things like LinkedIn. I mean, this kind of highlights how much the research frontier in economics and finance, a lot of it is actually scraping text. So I've seen papers scraping resumes, scraping LinkedIn homepages, you know, et cetera. We're only looking at job postings. But on that, yes, machine learning, in the number of job postings that mentioned machine learning is very low. It's probably like 0.1%, but it's at a massive growth rate. And we look at them and they're roughly equally split between job postings for these technologies that use the technology, like you will use machine learning to do this, and job postings that produce it, like you will work in a company that develops machine learning software. So, but collectively, these technologies are increasingly mentioned. So I suspect, I don't know, I don't want to give career advice, but yeah, my suspicion, if we looked at, I don't know, Akash, have you ever looked at CVs? I'm not aware of Burning Glass. I don't think we ever bought that stuff often.
Yeah, so Burning Glass has this product, which is job postings, and then it has another product, which is CVs. But we have never sort of like bought the other product.
It's an interesting thought. We could look at CVs. I bet you'd find in CVs the same words mimicking what employers are looking for, because exactly, you know, people want the jobs in these employers, and they probably put the words in their CVs.
Okay, thank you very much, Akash and Nick. I'm sure there are other questions, and if Akash is around, we can take some of those later. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I'm sure all of you enjoyed the two presentations. My task is very difficult now to sort of provide some comments and sort of create some ideas for discussion. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes. You can do, Rakesh. Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So, so I read both the papers and fascinating and interesting ideas there. And so I was asking myself this question, that since we are focusing on changing nature of innovation, on what dimensions we should be looking at, on what kind of changes we should be looking at. And after reading the papers, 3 or 4 things come to mind. So one question is, who innovates, who are the dominant actors. And if you go with what Ashish spoke about, who does R and who does D, and who actually brings the technology to the market. So one part of the changing nature of innovation could be who are the main actors in innovation. And we all know it can be business, government, higher education institutions, and Ashish spoke about the fact that the higher education institutions' role is on the rise. Within business, we have spoken about public and private, large, small startups, and Ashish particularly talked about the emerging role of startups in innovation. So one thing which is important is to identify the changing nature or changing contribution of different actors. And what Nick's paper contributes to this discussion is to say that you may want to look at the hubs as an important actor. It's a constellation of actors, but interestingly, many of these technologies emerge in hubs, and typically different players in these hubs collaborate to bring out these technologies. So there's an emerging, over time, emerging role of hubs in bringing out these innovations and doing the R as well as T. There have been other studies which have identified the role of users. So the papers today did not talk about it much, but there is another set of papers who have been basically saying that users play a critical role. Now, the other dimension in which we can look at in terms of changing nature of innovation is which are the sectors that are attracting innovation, where innovation is happening. We all know digital technologies have changed ways of doing things, including doing innovation. But Nick's paper brings out the role of emerging technologies. I mean, at one end, as Ashish pointed out, you may have chemicals being the dominant sector, and you may move to pharmaceuticals and biotechnology later on, and so on. Some of these technologies may be science-based, some of them may not be science-based. So Nick's paper talks about these 29 emerging technologies and how they are affecting the job market and roles of hubs. So the paper there is talking about diffusion of these technologies and how it is leading to deepening of the labor market, either in terms of skill broadening or regional broadening. But they also find out that they also show that the clusters or the hubs remain relevant, particularly for the high-end kind of activity. The third part of the innovation is the process of innovation. How does the entire process takes place? And Ashish's piece basically showed us that from a vertically integrated kind of a story to decentralization. And there are a large number of papers. He also talked about technology markets. There are a large number of papers who basically document the fact that increasingly innovations are being developed through collaborations across actors. Outsourcing is happening. A whole lot of decentralization is happening. So both the papers talk about these three dimensions in a fairly interesting manner. I'll have a couple of comments on these dimensions a little later. But before I do that, I just want to flag another segment of the nature of innovation, which may be interesting to look at if we are looking at the changing nature of innovation. And this is not something new which I am saying. I mean, if you look at the data that gets collected, one sees that there is some kind of a shift both in research writing as well as data collection, where we have moved away from product and process kind of focus to new types of innovation. Maybe these innovations existed earlier, but we have started to recognize them much more systematically now. Maybe these kinds of innovations have become much more dominant in recent times. So if you look at the Oslo manual itself for 92-97 versus 2005, it's being revised right now. They identify 4 types of innovation. Product and process we have been talking about, but they have added organizational innovation as well as marketing innovation. And many of the things like product design changes maybe earlier were taken part of product innovation and so on. The reason why I'm pointing this out is that increasingly the research that focuses on innovation and technology have started to recognize the fact that these 4 types of innovations are complementary in nature, and these complementarities get reflected in the type of actors who bring about these innovations, as well as the diffusion of these innovations over a period of time. So an increasing recognition of innovations which are not restricted to product and process is something which has come to the fore in recent times, when people have started to say, okay, what is happening in the innovation kind of space. So, what I'm arguing is that focusing on this shift is also an important part of looking at the changing nature of innovation. Now, having said that, I have a couple of things to say about the actors and the process of innovation. Now, we have already identified the actors earlier, and Ashish brought out very nicely the changing role of different actors. And he also said that he's talking about the US innovation ecosystem. And so I just wanted to flag this, that the ecosystem varies significantly across countries. And you would notice that the role of business and government and higher education is quite different across countries. So if you look at India, the government is still a major source of R&D, while higher education is about less than 4%. In the US, business is almost 72% and so on. So the point being made here is that the transitions that Ashish spoke about are underway at different spaces and at different paces and speeds in different countries. Many countries are still dependent on the government, and the role of higher education is quite small in many countries. The other part I wanted to flag was, the processes through which innovation is being developed. And as I said earlier, collaborations have grown rapidly in recent times. And I just want to sort of dig deeper into that a bit and identify a few things which I thought were quite interesting. Now, this is a table which I've taken from STIER's most recent publication. And here you find that the publications between 2015 and 19, the share of publications where there was some kind of a collaboration between industry and academia varied a great deal across countries. And once again, India here is the lowest, and Germany is on top. And similarly, if you look at the publications which entail some kind of international collaboration, once again, the pattern is quite different across countries, India being at the bottom once again. Now, the data that you have here does not really reflect a variety of interesting patterns. So the two numbers in red give you the proportion of international articles published by the US in science and engineering, having co-authors with that particular country. So, so the publications by the US it's about 26% of those were actually co-authored with the Chinese academics, while that number was less than 4% for India. Now, what is the underlying process through which this is happening? Is it because of doctoral students are in large numbers in the US from China? India also has a similar kind of number. Whether a large number go back to China to work and work collaboratively with them, or it is the degree of skill or capability that exists in different countries. But once again, the point being that while the collaborations, international collaborations and industry academia collaborations have increased over time, the patterns remain quite uneven across countries. Now, as I said, collaborations is a rise. The data on collaborations is somewhat limited. I saw recently a paper by Su, and what he had done was look at the patents that were filed with granted in the US between 76 and 2003, and calculated the proportion of those patents which had a foreign applicant. So from this huge pool, about 9% actually had a foreign applicant or inventor. So that means there was a fair bit of internationalization of the patenting activity. And this percentage changed from about 5% in 76 to 17%, which means that the role of foreign inventors or applicants had gone up significantly in the US during this period. Part of this might be linked to the emergence of large number of R&D labs of multinationals, and they will obviously file patents in the US where you have inventors from the labs in different countries. The other thing which came out from this study was that the sectoral composition of the so-called international patents, where you have a foreign applicant or inventor, was different across industries. So the range which Su reports is 6% for games and 18% for pharmaceuticals. So once again, the pattern that we are seeing of collaborations, international collaborations particularly, may be varying significantly across sectors. And finally, there are a couple of papers who have started to talk about the fact that although there is a significant amount of increase in collaborative research and development and patenting activity, effectively, it's still, we are still in a situation where the control over those patents which are built collaboratively still lies with a set of countries, particularly the developed countries. Here is some data which I got from Bai and Liu. What they have actually looked at a few sectors, including 3D printing, which Nick's presentation talked about, and big data. I don't want to get into the details of this table and look at specific numbers. So there are three estimates here. One is just the percentage of patents in this particular area where you had a foreign co-inventor. So you can see the range is between 1.6% for South Korea in 3D printing to 40% for Brazil. And the second column gives you the proportion of patents who with a domestic inventor with a foreign applicant, which means that some foreign applicant is controlling this technology. And the final column gives you, you have a foreign inventor, but it's a domestic applicant who has the assignment. So they control the technology. So just to sort of highlight a particular point, if you look at big data, US, only 1.3% of US patents around big data had a foreign inventor. And only 2.3% cases, there was a foreign applicant, which means that they had control. But in 16%, the inventor was foreign, but the US applicant was in control. So they were basically benefiting from that more than the US. And similarly, if you look at India on big data, as much as 81% of the patents filed in India around big data were with some foreign co-inventors. But all those plus more were actually filed by a foreign applicant, which means that the foreign applicant controlled the data. Only about 12% of them had a domestic applicant with foreign inventors. So the point being made here is that although one sees a significant change in the nature of collaboration and inventive activity over a period of time, the nature of control and who ultimately benefits or who appropriates still remains rather uneven. I'll stop here. I've taken more time than I had anticipated. Thank you very much. The floor is now open to questions and comments. So I have a few questions here. What would be the best way of spending the rest 5-10 minutes or so? There are a large number of questions. So is Mikhail still around? Or? So there are one question for Ashish, which says one issue, who does the R is the issue of dissemination of results. If corporations discover the new knowledge, would they keep it as a trade secret? This could inhibit JVs between corporations and universities, which may have a requirement to disseminate. Ashish?
Yeah, so I responded in the chat to Mikhail, but I think that's right. There would have to be some kind of an exclusivity that companies would want. But my sense is, if the research has important patent, can yield patentable results, then what this essentially would do is a delay, and that the company would file for the patents, and then the publication could ensue. So that there might be a delay. But I guess, well, let me stop here, because we could probably talk more about the issues between universities and companies. My sense is the universities themselves are being pushed to move further, to become more applied. That as companies are pulling back, I see increasing pressure on universities to fill at least part of the gap, at least in America. And the Bayh-Dole Act was one step, but there are others.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to. There was a question about the role of the Bayh-Dole Act. In your own paper, you say that the outcome is somewhat unclear. So you want to sort of spell that out a little more?
Well, so there's a number of things on the Bayh-Dole. One is what it does to the incentives of individual faculty and how it changes them. And that has been extensively discussed. And I think there's mixed evidence whether allowing professors to own title to their invention does or does not improve commercialization. What is definitely clear is that it has changed the incentives of university administrators Pankaj will resonate. This will resonate with him. There's much greater incentives on the part of university administrators to try to commercialize their research. You might think that would be a good thing. But if you look at the business model of at least American universities, we're much more effective operating as charities. So, if you look at how much licensing income a university like Duke gets, it's significant, it's probably 50, 60 million. But we routinely take more money in donations, in various kinds of gifts. And there is a sense in which these two modes of resource acquisition are in conflict. That the more the university tries to get into the commercialization of business, I think it potentially does interfere with its other missions. So,
sorry, go ahead.
No, other people may have, because this is an opinion, this is not based on research. So I should shut up and let other people voice their opinions.
Okay, so Pankaj has a question for Nick and Akash, and I actually had the same question. He's asking, what is the intuition behind the negative relationship with industry? And let me also add that you find a positive relationship with occupation. And unless occupations are specific to industry, one would expect the relationship with industry also to be positive.
Sorry, can I just ask for a clarification? So when you say positive and negative relationship, is this about dispersion?
Yeah, dispersion, about dispersion.
So I guess like there are 2 points to this. The first one is that if you look at dispersion across industries, even though we do find a negative relationship, it's insignificant. So we cannot sort of distinguish it from zero. And the second point to this is that like we take sort of the most narrow hierarchy of industry. So as you can believe, like even manufacturing is an industry, and then toy manufacturing is also an industry. So the definition of industry that we take is toy manufacturing and not manufacturing. So as you can imagine, like 3D printing as a technology could spread across toy manufacturing to medical prosthetics manufacturing and stuff like that. So whereas I mean it wouldn't sort of go out of manufacturing. So what I'm trying to say is that dispersion across industries is highly dependent on definition, and that's why we sort of didn't make a big deal out of it. We just said that the dispersion across locations is negative and super significant, and when we compare it to industries, it's strong. And there's stronger dispersion, there's stronger decrease in dispersion or decrease in concentration across locations than industries. But what we are not saying is that, I mean, we are not sort of saying that, oh, there's the negative relationship across industries and not so much across occupations, because that stuff is not statistically significant in the first place and depends a lot on how you define industries and occupations.
And also it will depend on these 29 technologies that you're looking at, because there's a possibility of digital technologies, a very broad kind of thing. I mean, 3D printing can only go in a certain set of industries.
Right.
Right. And that's true.
Right. So we did, that's actually an excellent point. So we did a bunch of sensitivity analysis. So in the sense that we have 29 technologies, so what we can make use of. So it's not 500 technologies, so that you can say that, look, digital technologies do this, manufacturing technologies do this and stuff like that. But what we can do is we excluded 3 technologies at a time, and then we recreated our patterns with 26 technologies randomly chosen every time. I mean, what we noticed is that at least the core patterns in the paper do not change that much, which was striking to us, because like this is not sensitive to just excluding 2 or 3 technologies and the results change. This is actually like a broader pattern than what we thought it is. But I mean, another factor this is like, of course, you do not expect fracking to move out of oil areas. You do not expect solar technology to move out of places where sun is a powerful resource. So of course there are differences across technologies. Yeah.
I We can take one more question. There's a question from Akshay Kirloskar. He's saying, with work from home expected to increase, would the advantage of technology hubs be reduced? And would the dispersion of high-skilled jobs be faster too?
Yeah, I think that's another excellent point. And I think Nick would have answered this much better because his recent research agenda is all about work from home. But we have sort of tried to look at a few things. And I mean, we are planning to look at a few things in burning glass job postings. So work from home has become a bigger deal in 2020, 2021. And if you see the sample that we're using is still 2019. So there's not that much incidence as of yet, but we do have the newer sample, so we can look for that stuff. And plus, we're planning to use some sort of like keywords in job postings, which suggest whether whether the firm is a startup. They will write that we are a startup in job posting. They'll write that this job is suitable for work from home and stuff like that. So we are thinking about interactions with this, but that's not in the paper yet. But it's a work in progress.
I think we'll stop here. Thank you very much for this wonderful session and a wonderful start for the conference. I personally thoroughly enjoyed the whole thing, and I'm sure all the participants also liked it much. I can see many comments in the chat box. So thank you very much for being there. Thank you very much, Ashish, Nick, and Akash for the presentations, and for everybody else who so actively participated. And we look forward to having you with us again tomorrow evening at 6. Till then, thank you very much.